The broadcast of the regular meeting of the Budget Committee will now begin.
Good morning. My name is Lene Palmisano. I'm the chair of the Budget Committee, and I'm going to call to order this regular committee for Monday, September 14th. Before we proceed, I will note for the record that this meeting has remote participation by council members and city staff as authorized under the provisions of Minnesota Open Meeting Law, Section 13D.021, due to the declared state of local public health emergency. At this time, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll to verify the presence of a quorum.
Councilmember Reich.
Present.
Gordon. Cunningham.
Present.
Ellison.
Present.
Osman. Goodman. Jenkins.
Here.
Kano.
Here.
Bender. Schrader.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
Fletcher. Gordon. Osman. Goodman. Bender. Fletcher. Chair Palmisano.
Present.
There are 8 members present.
I'm here. Apologies, I was late.
Oh, there are 9 members present.
Yep, thank you. Please let the record reflect that we have a quorum.
Sorry,
Colleagues-
Councilmember Jamal Osman is also here. Sorry.
Thank you, Councilmember Osman. Colleagues, today begins the Budget Committee's work on the city's 2021 budget. We have 2 receive and file items today. Item number 1 is our formal receipt of the mayor's 2021 recommended budget, which was referred to us by the City Council. Item number 2 is the overview of that budget presented to us by the Budget Office. After we dispense with that presentation and discussion, I will lay out our schedule going forward to consider and amend Mayor Fry's budget proposal. But first, I'll invite Micah Intermill, our city's budget director, to give his presentation. Welcome, Mr. Intermill.
Good morning, Chair Palmisano and members of the committee. My name is Micah Intermill, City Budget Director, and I'm pleased to join you today to provide the first of 2 overviews related to the 2021 city budget. This presentation will focus on the general fund and specifically the areas of current service level expenses, non-property tax revenues, and the impacts of the mayor's recommended levy increase for 2021. As always, I'm happy to take questions at any time. Could I have the next slide, please? This year has been a challenging and complicated year for city budgeting processes. You all have heard from me a lot about the current year budget, and we even had more conversation at the beginning of this year than in years past about the rollover process. That is the process of reappropriating project dollars from last year's budget that went up unspent. Because even in the best of years, it's sometimes challenging to remember how the budget process unfolds. I hope you'll agree that it's good to start at the beginning and walk through the city's budget framework. Each year, we start with calculating the cost of the current service level, which I'll go to in detail on 24. I will go into detail on for 2021 in the coming slides. Then the mayor meets with departments to determine what changes he or she may want to make. In recent years, these have been adds to the current service level, and this year we will see both adds and subtractions. That mayor's recommended budget is then handed off to you, the council, to make any changes you see fit. Once passed and signed into law by the mayor, that document and the decisions within it become the council adopted budget. Next slide, please. That general framework is quite familiar to all of you, and it's pretty well understood even by casual observers of City Hall. How we set the current service level, though, hasn't received much airtime in the last several years. Given that it serves as the starting point and this year's budget reductions will take away from that foundation, I want to walk you through how we set it and what the various impacts are this year. Next slide, please. The current service level, or the orange bubble from the previous slide, is itself a sum of individual parts. Each year, we calculate the current service level for each department and program by summing up the calculated costs of personnel for the next year, adding in the costs of internal services provided, and layering on top of that any non-personnel base funding for programs or operations. Next slide, please. The first and largest segment of the current service level is the city's calculated personnel costs. Personnel costs generally account for about 70% of all general fund expenditures. The calculated personnel costs included in the current service level are based on the current roster of employees and any approved vacant positions. Each year in March, the Budget Office reviews that current roster and applies step progression, cost of living adjustments, anticipated increases to health insurance costs, and any changes, if any, to para rates, that is the Public Employee Retirement Association, to create an estimate for the payroll costs of each employee for the following year. For 2021, calculated personnel is growing by only 1%, or about 3 million. This is lower than the 3% growth assumption included in our 5-year financial direction, and that savings is a direct result of a change in methodology in calculating wage growth for this year. In prior years, last slide, please. In prior years, we would generate an assumed payroll cost for each job classification. This year, with the implementation of a new budget system included in the 2019 budget, we were able to estimate payroll costs on an individual by individual basis. In doing so, we're able to take into account the precise costs of step progression and healthcare elections in a way that saves the general fund roughly $6 million in this year's budget. Also of note this year, because of continued positive experience with our movement to self-insurance for medical, the city's health insurance premium costs are increasing by just 1.7%. This compares to increases in the high single to low double digits in the not too recent past. Lastly, it's important for me to mention that the calculated personnel costs were recalculated in early August this year to incorporate changes made during the 2020 revised budget process. This includes the movement of several positions out of the Minneapolis Police Department and into the City Clerk and Communications departments. Next slide, please. The second segment of the current service level calculation is internal cost allocations. These are monies paid by city departments to city departments in exchange for the provision of business type activities such as our civil legal services, our IT department, rents paid, fleet, etc. Costs increase or decrease in current service level allocations only when the costs of the given service increase. So just as with external businesses, internal business operations calculate their anticipated expenses from one year to the next and develop a cost allocation model to recover monies to cover those expenses. Just to be very clear, these are not money-making enterprises for the city, and we do our level best to hold the growth of those costs down. But when the cost of doing business increases, the cost of the charges increase as well. Some examples, as noted on the slide, include increases to various maintenance contracts for IT systems, or as heating and cooling expenses grow for our buildings, those expenses are passed along to the customer departments in the city. Next slide. This year, internal cost allocations are growing by approximately 4%, or $3 million in the general fund. This growth matches the assumption included in the 5-year financial direction, and it's actually the first of the last several years that the growth here has matched the assumed growth in the 5-year financial direction. In the past several years, it's been exceeding that assumption, and so all of our internal service providing departments, particularly Public Works Fleet, has done a good job of controlling costs this year for the current service level. Next slide, please. The third and final segment of our current service level calculation is the non-personnel base. And we've begun talking over the last several years about this segment, and in particular, policymakers have raised questions such as what's in the base. And these are good questions that my team and I had hoped to further tease out this year. Unfortunately, as with most of our colleagues across the enterprise, our work plans for the year went out the window in March. We've not been able to develop to make deep progress on illuminating the specifics of each dollar in the base. We will continue that endeavor next year. However, we can say with certainty that base dollars only exist because they were put there at one point by the council. Base dollars include two distinct, equally important categories. Program dollars, those necessary to deliver a given program or department's mission. Typically, those dollars are used for and in community, whether through contracts for services or direct grant and aid, and discretionary operating expense. These are monies used to run the operations of the enterprise, similar to other private or public entities, and include categories such as travel, training, membership, subscriptions, etc. Anytime the council includes an ongoing change item, the non-personnel dollars included are added or subtracted in the next year's base. Next slide, please. In most years, the non-personnel base does not grow, and this is because, as I mentioned before, the base is set by the ongoing changes incorporated by council. 2021 is slightly different, however, as non-personnel dollars are growing by roughly 1% or $500,000. This is due to some cleanup work performed by my staff to identify persistent vacancies held open from year to year by departments in order to garner salary savings. In each of the past 3 years, we've heard concerns from council members about this practice. So in an effort to get ahead of the question this year, we worked with departments to make those structural changes where they made sense in the 2021 base. Next slide, please. In total, the 2021 current service level expenses and transfers, which this year those transfers equal $18.5 million, come to about $525 million. As the mayor mentioned in his address on August 14th, because some of the revenue changes I'm about to discuss, this would have required an increase to the property tax levy of roughly $50 million to cover in full. As a result, the mayor is recommending total expenditures and transfers of only $498.5 million, a reduction of between $26 and $27 million, or a cut of about 5%. Next slide, please. Next, we'll discuss the non-property tax revenue sources, which consist of various fees and charges that offset specific services provided, such as business license or construction permit fees, or various general revenues such as franchise fees, or the transferring of certain local taxes to the general fund. As you know, the way we determine the property tax levy each year is to start by determining the total expense of the set of services we intend for the city to perform in a given year, and subtract from that total amount, the revenues to the general fund beyond property taxes. The resulting gap is the amount necessary to raise from property taxes.
Mr. Intermill, could we just pause for a brief second and for any questions about the previous slides? I will note for the record that Councilmember Goodman has joined us, and I will call on Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Director Intermill. I wanted first to just say how much I appreciate the work that went into changing the methodology that saved a good chunk of money. So thank you for that, as well as the structural changes. Both of those are much appreciated. I had a question specifically around the internal cost allocation. I know that there are, there's the rent and the various heating and cooling costs. Has there been any calculations around how that will change when the new public service center is up and running?
Chair Palmisano and Councilmember Cunningham, that's a good question. And in general, I don't have specific numbers off the top of my head, but in general, the costs of running the new public service building are supported by the elimination of outside leases. And so we have, that was sort of part of the whole philosophy behind the new public service building was consolidating city staff into primarily 2 buildings, those who work downtown into primarily 2 buildings. So we are shedding those outside leases, so we don't have those costs, and instead those monies are being put towards running our own public service center. And so there is not a noticeable increase in expense related to operating that facility.
Great, thank you. So we're expecting for it to probably break close to even.
In terms of what we had been paying for previously and what we will be paying for in the future, yes, we expect those to be pretty comparable. Of course, we have debt service costs associated with the borrowing that we did for the new building, and those are being supported, as you'll see later on in the presentation. We had been levying for there was a referendum to take debt on to support the library system. That debt is going away, and instead it's being repurposed to pay for this new building. But in total, on net, looking at the program, there's not a significant increase in costs.
Great, thank you so much.
I'm not seeing any other questions. Thanks.
Great. Can we have the next slide, please? So in total, our non-property tax general fund revenues are estimated to be roughly $48 million, or 16% lower in 2021 than in 2020. The chart in front of you is split between 2 different types of revenues. Those which are generated directly by the general fund, and those are highlighted in blue, and those which are largely generated outside of the general fund but are transferred into the general fund to support its operation. And those are highlighted in orange. As we walk through the categories, it'll become clear that the own fund revenues, those highlighted in blue, are relatively stable. I don't intend to walk you through every category on the slide, but I do want to highlight a few. The first line of this table shows charges for sales and services. This includes charges for various services that directly benefit a particular customer, such as loan origination fees and CPED, or charges for cuts into the city streets for work done by Excel and CenterPoint Energy. The largest revenue source in this category is what we call general fund overhead. That is the recovery of general fund expense that benefit our internal service funds and our enterprise funds. These self-supporting operations rely on services performed by the general fund functions, such as human resource, finance, neighborhood and community relations, the city clerk, and others. And they pay the general fund for those services accordingly. Just as the general fund pays the internal service funds for the services they provide, the internal service and enterprise funds pay into the general fund for the services it provides them. General fund overhead is increasing by roughly $3 million this year, and that helps offset anticipated slight decreases in loan origination and development fees and CPED. So that charges for sales and services does increase by about 5.3%. The licenses and permits category is largely driven by construction permit and business licensing activity. Though the construction permit activity in particular has remained robust through the pandemic, we do anticipate some level of cooling in that market next year. It's important to keep in mind that the expenses in this area generally lag the revenues by anywhere between 1 and 3 years. This is because fees are paid when permits are issued prior to a given project's commencement, and inspection activity is performed after the project is complete. We'll still need to continue to maintain robust staffing and development services through the recession because A, that work will persist as I've just described, and B, because these fees have been paid into the city over the past several years to support that work. License and permit revenues are expected to be down by $3.3 million, or about 7% in 2021. Special assessments are set to increase by $1.2 million in 2021. This is due to the full dissolution of the Regulatory Services Revolving Fund, which has been used since the Great Recession to collect revenues and expenses primarily related to nuisance abatement work in and around residential properties. Several years ago, Regulatory Services identified a problem of structural imbalance in that fund. They, along with finance and policymakers, will have fully solved that problem with all activity previously contained in the Regulatory Services Revolving Fund integrating fully into the general fund in 2021. That brings $1.2 million of special assessment revenue, as well as an equal amount of offsetting expense to the general fund next year. Miscellaneous revenues will be down next year, largely related to fewer dollars collected associated with the recapture of loans unpaid in CPED. Interest earnings will be down due to the anticipated continued recession environment we're in. And excluding local government aid, our revenues from the state will be similar in 2021 to what we saw in 2020. These revenues largely include public safety pension aids, which remain stable year to year, absent any legislation that may change them, but also include municipal state aid for road improvements. The source of those aids, that municipal state aid, is the state's gas tax, and as the gas tax goes up or down, those municipal state aid monies increase or decrease. Because of the decreased use of vehicles in this pandemic, the gas tax revenues have decreased, therefore municipal state aid decreases. The largest decline that you see on this slide, though, fall in two areas: local government aid and transfers in. The amount of local government aid each jurisdiction receives in a given year is dependent on, one, the total amount of local government aid provided by the state, and two, a regression formula that estimates local need. Local government aid was built to be a relief valve on property taxes, so the formula assumes as a jurisdiction's property values increase, its needs for relief decrease. Minneapolis has grown impressively over the past several years. This growth has outpaced the growth seen in other jurisdictions, so the formula tells state lawmakers that our need is less. Our intergovernmental relations team tried to find a solution to this problem last legislative session, but as it was a short and distance session, unfortunately a solution did not materialize. As a result, our local government aid will decrease by just under $4 million or 5% in 2021. And that brings us to the transfers in. Each year we plan for transfers in from two primary sources, the parking fund and the downtown assets fund. In 2021, the parking fund transfer will proceed as planned. The downtown assets fund transfer, however, will not. The downtown assets fund transfer consists of the transfer of entertainment taxes, which can be paid, which by state law can be used for any purpose, and the transfer of other local taxes, which under state law can be used to support economic development activities and capital improvements only. We project that our local taxes will continue to be depressed next year due to the continued social distancing impacts of the pandemic, noticeably the prohibition of large gatherings. In our 5-year financial direction, we had planned a $33 million transfer from the Downtown Assets Fund to the general fund. However, in 2021, we will forgo $22 million of that transfer. Next slide, please. This slide attempts to put into context what all of those changes mean for the general fund mix of funding. As you see, the non-property tax own fund revenues to the general fund, those shown in light blue, remain stable from 2020 into 2021. Transfers in and other revenues, which includes local government aid and the transfers I just mentioned, those dollars shown in orange shrink noticeably. And as a result, property tax revenues need to increase to support the level of spending previously discussed. These changes mean that the city will be more dependent on property taxes in 2021. Many of you noted early on in the recession that the specific impacts of the pandemic, notably the decline in commuting workers and those seeking entertainment opportunities in the city, will necessitate a change in the way we fund our city. And this graphic and these statistics bear that out. Next slide, please. So in total, our current service level expenses exceed our available revenues, including the 5.75% increase to the property tax levy recommended by the mayor, by between $26 and $27 million. Absent these cuts, the levy would have needed to grow by another 8% or more. In order to balance our budget, cuts are needed. The budget office is working with the mayor and departments to finalize documentation of those cuts, and we anticipate that documentation to be ready for your review 1 week from tomorrow on September 22nd. Work has been done to minimize the impacts of the cuts, but cuts are never without pain. As I mentioned earlier this year, with respect to the cost containment measures put into place through the 2020 revised budget, we cannot expect to get the same amount of work done with significantly fewer resources available to do that work. At the same time, many of the same needs present in our city prior to the pandemic and civil unrest persist. You all and the mayor have been clear in the need to continue investing to help solve some of those problems, in particular those around affordable housing, economic inclusion, and public safety. As the mayor indicated in his address on August 14th, his recommendation will include planned increases in those areas, so the cuts to the base will need to be greater than 5% in order to make room to add funds back to support these priorities. Happy to pause there on any questions related to that last set of slides.
I'm not seeing any questions or comments.
Great. Next slide, please. So next, I'll walk you through the changes to the property tax levies recommended by the mayor, and then spend our remaining time talking through the impacts of those taxes on Minneapolitans. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the mayor is recommending a total increase to the city property tax levies, inclusive of the independent boards, of 5.75%. The general fund levy increases by 8.44% to support the spending priorities discussed a few moments ago. The mayor is including room for the park board's requested levy increase of 1.18%, which will support the operations and maintenance of the Commons Park a few blocks from City Hall. This expense had been paid by local sales taxes through the Downtown Assets Fund, but will be shifted to a funding model used similar to all of the other city parks. The debt levy is increasing
I've lost all sound. Has anybody else?
Chair Palmisano, this is CJ. I think Micah may have just lost connection.
I see. I thought it was just me here. Let's just pause for a second and see if we can't get him back online. Let's see.
I'll try to reach out to Micah.
Yeah, I do see him active on Skype, so. CJ, it does say that his internet died. He just sent me a text message, so let's give him just a minute to call back in.
Councilmember, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you for rejoining us.
Great.
Are you great?
My
Thanks.
apologies.
All good.
Apologies for those technical difficulties. So I think I was just discussing the debt levy. The debt levy is increasing in accordance with plan levels and also to accommodate a slight increase associated with some actions taken by mayor and council earlier 2020 budget challenges. The pension levies remain flat this year. This is reflective of good work done over the last several years by our former CFO, now city coordinator, Mark Ruff, to stabilize our funding of the closed Minneapolis pensions now merged with the Public Employees Retirement Association. The MBC levy decreases by roughly $2 million as the city will utilize accumulated fund balances within the MBC to pay for much of our rent next year. The mayor is recommending the reinstatement of a levy for the Board of Estimate and Taxation, as a similar approach to the one I just described with the MBC was utilized in 2020 with that Board of Estimate and Taxation as it drew on its own reserves to fund its operations. And the last two levies shown remain constant to support our obligations to the Teachers Retirement Association and for repayment of debts associated with the library referendum of the mid-2000s and the new building project as discussed with Councilmember Cunningham earlier this morning. The library debt will be retired at mid-year, at which point the remaining funds will be used to support the new building project. Beginning in 2022, this levy will be used to support the new building in full. Next slide, please. So what does all of that mean for an individual property tax bill? This is a good and obvious question, which always includes a confusing answer. So I've included a screen grab from the video my office put together last year in conjunction with the city clerk and a team from our communications department to try and provide a plain, if lengthy, answer to this question. A link to the video on YouTube is included on the screen, and I do believe the video has been put into circulation on city channels or will be put into circulation shortly. The property tax equation is multivariate. That is to say, the equation includes multiple variables that, when considered in relation to all other properties, yields the answer. So generally speaking, individual property taxes are dependent on the total property taxes levied. In our case, this year, the mayor is recommending that total levy should be 5.75% more than what was levied in 2020. It's also dependent on the total tax capacity of the city, and that is an estimate of how much tax could reasonably be paid given the total value of properties in the city and the tax capacity of a given property. And tax capacity is determined by the property's value and what kind of property it is. So residential properties are assumed to have a lower tax capacity than similarly valued commercial, apartment, and industrial properties. As these factors go up or down, the taxes for an individual property go up or down. So property taxes are often described as a balloon. If you think about holding a balloon in your hands, as you squeeze with your right hand, you'll feel it bulge out in your left hand and vice versa. The bottom line is an individual's property tax is dependent on the total levy, whether it grows or shrinks, and the change of their individual property value in relation to the total change of property value in the city. Next slide, please.
Mr. Intermill, if I can just pause you here. Evidently, some people can't use the chat function. Some of the council members here aren't able to see it right now. There's a bit of a glitch, but I do want to call on Council Member Fletcher and then pause for any others that maybe would like to ask a question and have been trying to get our attention here. Council Member Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. Director Intermill, going back to the service level cuts, sorry, I was trying to get in and we had chat issues, so I'm coming in a little late. I think one of the questions that I've had, I think there's a tough balance to strike when we're thinking about these cuts between really wanting to lean on the hiring freeze as a way of avoiding layoffs, which is obviously one of our goals. We'd like to minimize disruption to city staff as much as we can, and I think we're all kind of united in that goal. But at the same time, that leaves us vulnerable to cuts that are not strategic, that are cuts that are happening because of where individual workers are in their careers and their goals, and we might end up finding ourselves not cutting in places that we probably should strategically be cutting, because that doesn't happen to be where employees are looking to leave or are looking to make career changes, and then putting our cuts more in places that we actually might strategically really want to lean into. And so there's a risk of doing the more sort of passive hiring freeze related service level cuts, or budget cuts, as opposed to some more strategic and proactive service level changes. And so I guess I'm wondering, maybe I'm jumping ahead by a week and we'll get these answers next week, but can you give us a sense of to what extent are the cuts that we're contemplating relying on one strategy or the other? How proactive are the cuts that are being considered by department heads versus sort of waiting to see who's moving on or retiring or otherwise transitioning their employment?
Sure. Chair Palmisano and Councilmember Fletcher, it's a good question, and I think cuts straight to the heart of the policy challenges that all of you and the mayor face with this budget environment. And so I think that in thinking through the various approaches, a continued hiring freeze going versus going more directly into layoffs, it's challenging. I think it's challenging to get to knowing which layoffs are the quote unquote right layoffs to enact in a short amount of time. And I think we, particularly when you look at the way that our city is changing in terms of how it's funded, as well as just how we feel our city changing around us and the needs for services, I think we truly are at an inflection point. And as I look at the hiring freeze in 2021, I think that coupled with the early retirement incentive program strategy, which that the incentive is still being developed, and I anticipate it will be the framework for that incentive will come before council in the next cycle or two. Those two things together create space to be able to more thoughtfully evaluate what the resource needs are in a given department in order to deliver the desired service level. And so I think your point about a hiring freeze to some extent puts decisions in fate's hand, but it also, as it is a temporary solution, it sort of buys more time to get to a future solution. So it's a hiring freeze rather than the elimination of these positions in order to take advantage of that time, if that rambling answer made sense.
I see Councilmember Fletcher's on mute. It did make sense to me, Director Intermel. Councilmember Fletcher, did you have any further questions?
That answered my question. Thank you.
Thanks. I just want to pause briefly and see if any of my other colleagues who maybe couldn't put their name in the meeting chat have questions or concerns. I'm also available and can interrupt the presentation here if you want to just IM me through our Skype function. I'm not seeing any. Go ahead.
Great. So I think one last piece that I would add to that last question, because it highlights an important feature of this year's budget process, and that is these, as I said, these are important conversations to have that will take time. Also, they may require a more iterative process this year than we're used to, and I think that's not only in terms of this year and this year's budget, in fact, has already rolled out or is in the process of rolling out in stages, but I think it highlights that into next year, when we see what the impacts of that early retirement incentive program are, that may trigger additional needs to rebudget. So I think the point there is this is a conversation that we're not starting it today. We've been talking all year, and we're not going to stop it in December. We will likely be talking about the 2021 budget into next year. So back to the presentation itself, there are three major factors impacting Minneapolis property taxes in 2021. So first, though the growth from 2020 into 2021 in terms of market value is pretty similar to what we saw in prior years, it's concentrated this year in apartment and commercial property types rather than being equally shared across all properties. And so that shifts the burden from residential parcels. And when we talk about residential parcels, we're talking about primarily detached single-family homes, but also condos, duplexes, and triplexes. Shifts the burden from that property type to apartments, commercial, and industrial parcels. And you'll see in a few slides how that will have some unanticipated impacts on property tax bills this year. Second, and this is truly the biggest impact to taxes this year, is the expiration of the consolidated TIF district. And the consolidated TIF district was a very large district that encompassed downtown East, the North Loop, the Mississippi River waterfront on the southern edge of the river from I-35 all the way through North Minneapolis, as well as area around Target Field and area in Uptown. And so this is a very large district that has a lot of tax capacity in it just by virtue of the properties that are in that pool. That district goes offline at the end of this year, and so next year the full $33 million of tax capacity captured in that district comes into the general pool. And so as the size of the pie grows, the size of the individual slices shrinks. The third factor is, and this is a good news story with relation to the fiscal disparities program, which is a little bit of a change from the last few years when I've talked about the fiscal disparities program. It's been a bad news story for the city. In the past few years, we've been sending more and more of our tax base to the fiscal disparities pool, which is a program through the state that intends to share tax base across the metro region, so that we don't compete with each other for businesses or for additional residents. This year, our distribution back from the pool grew by 8%, which was faster than our contribution to the pool, which grew by 6%. And so that means on net, we get to keep a greater percentage of our tax capacity, which reduces the tax burden on each individual property within Minneapolis. Next slide, please. So when taking all of these factors into account, in general, properties in the city will experience a feels like factor of -6%. That is to say, to determine how an individual's property taxes will change from 2020 into 2021, the owner can look at the percentage change in their market value and subtract 6%. The resulting percentage is what they can expect the growth or reduction in their taxes to be. So if a property's value grew by 6%, its taxes would remain unchanged from 2020 because 6 minus 6 equals 0. If the value grew by 3%, taxes would go down by 3%. Again, 3 minus 6 equals -3. And if the value went unchanged, taxes would go down on that property by 6%. The chart on the right of the screen shows the market values for various property types at the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile, and the impacts on taxes for those properties. And it may be hard to read on the slide, but it's also included in the materials in the LIMS file for the 2021 city budget, which were made available on August 14th. The figures on this slide do have a slight update because we've received more recent and accurate information from the county, but they're similar to what was seen on the 14th. Each year we highlight the impacts of the median value homesteaded home. So that's a home that you both own and live in. This year, that median valued home is valued at $281,500, and its value grew by about 2%. Because of the impacts I walked through on the prior slide, that parcel's tax capacity as a share of the total tax capacity shrank. As a result, its owners will see a decrease in their taxes of about $59 or 4%. So again, the value grew by 2%, the taxes will decrease by 4%. This chart also shows the tax increases will be seen and felt in commercial and apartment parcels in the coming year, which does make intuitive sense given that the growth we've seen in these markets over the last several years has been so expansive. I've included two other notes on this slide with respect to residential parcels in particular. First, the values of lower valued homes are growing faster than the values of greater valued homes. And this is good news from a wealth generation and retention standpoint for those homeowners. However, it also means that the lower value homes will see greater percentage increase in their taxes as values continue to even out across the city. Individuals on fixed incomes who may be living in homes held over multiple generations may feel pinched in particular. And for those folks, actually for all folks, I encourage utilization of the state's property tax relief programs, which we'll talk about at the end of this presentation. The last point here is that as residential values increase, less of that home's value is excluded from the calculation of its tax base. And so the homestead market value exclusion program reduces the total taxes paid for properties valued under $413,800. And it is also that participation in that market value exclusion program is a qualifying factor for homeowners to be able to receive the Minnesota property tax refund that, again, I'll discuss in a few slides. So as homestead residential values continue to grow in the city, less and less Minneapolis homeowners will be able to take advantage of these state programs aimed to provide property tax relief. And that's more of an FYI than anything else. Next slide, please.
I just want to pause there and ask my colleagues if they have any questions or thoughts about the slide. I also wanted to mention that on that last slide, just to reiterate a couple things you mentioned. One is that this is not final, but more of a draft using county data as presented in the August 14th mayor's budget presentation. Is that right, Director?
That's correct, Madam Chair.
And then the other piece is it is really it is a challenge to understand without a lot of graphs and going into its own presentation, but the homestead exclusion factor kind of bottoms out at a certain point. And do you happen to know, Director Intermill, what that new point is that the homestead exclusion zeroes out?
Madam Chair, thank you for the question. So the homestead market value exclusion phases out at for homes that are valued at $413,800. And so right now, it's hard to see on the slide, but the 75th percentile valued homestead residential property is valued at $380,500. So it's getting very close to that phase out. And so while I didn't have a chance to run the numbers before this presentation, roughly, probably around 20% of properties, homestead residential properties in Minneapolis can no longer take advantage of that program. And that $413,800 phase out is set in state law. It's not indexed, so it doesn't grow each year as home values increase. And that may be something that the city might consider adding to its legislative agenda this year and in future years.
Thank you. Councilmember Goodman is in queue, and I'm going to call on her next. Councilmember Goodman. She's on her phone, so she may need to do a *6. We're not hearing her. I'll give her a chance to figure that out, and why don't you go ahead to the other slide? We'll come back to her.
Certainly. So this slide is one you're all familiar with. It shows the distribution of changes to residential market values from the assessment for taxes payable 2020 to the assessment for taxes payable next year in 2021. And each year we perform this analysis excluding parcels that are valued less than $30,000 and also excluding those which have experienced construction in the last year or those whose property classification changes. So if somebody moved out of their home and started renting that detached single-family home out, it's no longer a homesteaded home, and so we would exclude that from this calculation. And all of these exclusions are our attempt to get an apples-to-apples comparison of the impacts both of the market and the levy on taxes across the city. So the x-axis, so along the bottom of the chart, shows the changes in percentile changes in market value, and the y-axis, so going along the side, shows the percentage of residential parcels that fall into each percentile. In prior years, this chart has looked much more like a normal distribution or bell-shaped curve, with the majority of changes in value happening towards the middle of the chart, with tails on either side. But as I just mentioned, lower valued properties are converging on that median, and higher value properties the valuations are largely staying stable. So as a result, the bars on this chart this year are concentrated towards the left side of the chart. And that's good news for residential property taxpayers this year, as indeed nearly 50% of residential parcels will see no change in value from 2020 into 2021. Let's see. Could we have the next slide, please? Great. So this is a similar chart, but showing the estimated tax increases rather than the changes in market value. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the feels like factor this year is -6%. So homeowners who saw an increase of value of 5% or less will see a decrease in the Minneapolis portion of their property taxes. It's slightly mind-bending to understand how a 5.75% levy increase means nearly 3/4 of homeowners will see a decrease in their taxes. But it all goes back to the three major drivers discussed earlier, most notably the expiration of the consolidated TIF district and the inclusion of that additional $33 million in the general tax pool. Budget Office staff will produce data and charts on market value and tax changes for each of your awards in the coming days. We can also produce them for apartment and residential, or apartment, commercial, and industrial parcels as well. And again, it's important to note that for all of this analysis, when we talk about a property tax decrease, we're talking about the Minneapolis portion of the bill. Next slide, please. So to me, there are three big takeaways with respect to the impacts of tax changes this year in Minneapolis. So again, first, as I mentioned, nearly 3/4 or 74% of all residential parcels will see a decrease to their Minneapolis tax bill, not taking into account changes in Hennepin County or Minneapolis Public Schools taxes. These percentages are slightly less for non-homesteaded or rental parcels, and slightly greater for homesteaded or owner-occupied parcels. Second, 17% of all residential parcels will see an increase of between 0 and 6%. This is slightly more for non-homesteaded or slightly less for homesteaded parcels. So in total, adding those together, with a levy increase of 5.75%, roughly 91% of all residential parcels will see a change to their property taxes of 6% or less. And what this does is really debunks everything I've ever said when somebody says, well, if the levy's increasing by 5.75%, won't my taxes just increase by 5.75%? And the answer this year is they're likely to increase. Chances are very good that they'll increase by that levy increase or much lower. And third, as we recognize that Minneapolis is now a majority rental city, it's noticeable that 62% of all apartment parcels will see a tax decrease. 22% of apartment parcels will see an increase between 0 and 6%. So similar to the 91% in residential parcels, 84% of apartment parcels will see a change of their property taxes of 6% or less.
Director Intermill, we're going to pause here for a question or comment from Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. I wanted to ask about that a little bit because on the previous slide, you had indicated that on average, apartment buildings were going to see an increase. And so I guess I'm curious if 62% of them are going to see a decrease. Is there some smaller percentage on the margin that is increasing dramatically that's pulling up that average? Or what's the driver here for what look to be a little bit contradictory data? Is there some either geographically distinctive or other kind of factor that's making some apartment buildings see a more significant increase?
So, Madam Chair and Councilmember Fletcher, this is a good and important question, and one that I've been sifting through the data to understand better myself. And I think it's two things. So this analysis is looking at parcels that were similarly situated last year. So if a new building came online this year, they would not be picked up in this analysis. So I think that's part of it. But also if we were to look at a chart similar to the one I just developed just showed you for the residential parcels, you would see the largest segment of apartment buildings is seeing that decrease. There's a blip, there's a spike at 8%. And so that is what pulls the median higher. So you were right in your assumption that we do see, and this is referring just to the residential parcels. But if this were to, if I would have developed this chart for apartment parcels, we would see both a high blue on the left-hand side, and we would see a spike blue in the 8% line as well. And so those are the two most likely scenarios, is either a decrease or an 8% increase. But fully 84% of parcels will see a change to their taxes of 6% or less.
Thank you. I guess I'm wondering if there's anything that if we've looked at trends, or maybe this is a question for the city assessor about what qualities of apartment housing are putting them in the 8% category. I guess I'm wanting to understand, is that NOAA properties that are rising in value as people are making speculative purchases, or is that our high-end apartment buildings seeing an increase? I think that has dramatically different policy implications for us depending on sort of which buildings are seeing higher increases.
Madam Chair and Councilmember, I agree that it's absolutely the question to ask, and I don't know that I'm the right one to answer it in this moment.
Sounds good. We will dig into this further as we proceed with the budget. I want to call on Council President Bender, and I also want to just make sure my colleagues know that the chat feature is simply not working for many of you as we try to get them to. So please just instant message me or text me or just interrupt as you might have comments or questions so that we can make sure that we're proceeding in a timely way. Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for supporting us all through the various technical issues. I just wanted to follow up on Councilmember Fletcher's questions, and thank you, Mr. Intermill, for looking into it too. Over the years, I've had a number of meetings about this issue related to how we're valuing rental property. And I think it's fair to say that the way that state law directs local governments to assess property are not in line with our goals related to supporting housing stability in Minneapolis. It hasn't you know, my take is that it will be very, very challenging to change that at the state level, but certainly worth an effort to do so. You know, for me, I've focused more energy on other various things related to rental protections and other things. But now we have a nice coalition of local elected officials who are working on housing stability and particularly around renter protection. So I think it is worth us continuing to understand the ways in which the assessment laws or practices affect these goals. So for example, on one of the last questions that Councilmember Fletcher asked, you know, we know that building sales in a neighborhood, even if it's new construction being sold from one bank to another, affect the assessed property of all of the rental property in the neighborhood. And that's a thing, for example, that is counter to our goal of stabilizing rents in older buildings, in NOAA properties, that appears to be out of the city's control. So again, I just want to flag it as well for future follow-up, and noting that it seems very challenging to change state law in this space, but I think worth us understanding the ways in which we would like to and starting to build a coalition around these issues, along with all the other things that we're doing to support housing stability in the city.
Good point.
So if there are no other questions, I think that that's actually a very good segue to this last point that I wanted to make, and that is, though taxes are going down for most, there's still a burden for many in our community. And again, this year, I encourage all of you to reach out through various channels to your constituents to encourage them to participate in the state's property tax refund program. And I've included a link to that information here on the slide. There are programs available for homeowners as well as renters, and both programs are dependent on income eligibility. Everyone should apply, though, as the programs do have the potential to return meaningful dollars to many in our community, and I think to make up for some of those policy blind spots highlighted by the council president. And that brings us to the end of the information I've prepared for you today. I'm happy to stand for any additional questions that you may have.
Thank you, Director. So the comment or question from earlier from Councilmember Goodman, who wasn't able to get her voice onto this call, was simply to remind us all that the city portion of what a property owner pays in property taxes is less than half the bill. Can you comment on, even casually, how some of these other budgets are shaping up that also make up that part of the tax equation for homeowners in Minneapolis?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Councilmember Goodman. She always has a good way of bringing up good points that I had forgot to include in my presentation. So the city portion of the bill represents about 40% of the property tax bill. So for somebody living in the city of Minneapolis, their property tax is 40% city, 40% Hennepin County, and about 20% Minneapolis Public Schools. Just through the media, I've heard the county board's desire to have a flat levy this year. And I've not heard anything about the Minneapolis Public Schools and what their property tax levy changes may be for 2021.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments about this presentation? Just go ahead and go ahead, please, because I can't see who to call on next. All right, then. Seeing no further discussion, at this point, I'll direct the clerk to receive and file. I'll direct the clerk to receive and file the mayor's 2021 recommended budget, as well as Mr. Intermill's overview. Before we adjourn today, I'd like to take the opportunity to review for the public and for my colleagues the anticipated timeline in which we'll work to complete our budget process. The next step will be to receive presentations drilling down into the details of each department's proposed budget. We'll begin those presentations at our next meeting, which is scheduled for September 24th at 10 a.m. and continue through early November. Council members, you've already received invites for all of these meetings, and the clerk's office is working to notice them for the public. My office is working with the budget office to finalize which departments will be presenting at each meeting, and we will share that information as soon as possible, both to council members and to the public. This committee also has a scheduled public hearing on the proposed budget for November 16th at 10 a.m. This is in addition to the 2 public hearings that will be held at meetings of the City Council on December 2nd and 9th. Both of those are at 6:05 p.m. And finally, I'll note that we'll consider amendments to the mayor's recommended budget at our meetings on December 3rd and 4th. These revisions will get forwarded to the City Council for final consideration at our last public hearing on December 9th, again at 6:05 p.m. As with all our other meetings, these meetings and public hearings will be conducted virtually using our online platform, and the schedule will be published on the calendar that is posted in LIMS and available from the city's website. Are there any questions from my colleagues? Go ahead and jump in. I believe Councilmember Cunningham had a question about when are we getting the mayor's change items, and I believe the answer is September 24th, but I'll turn that over to Director Intermill to correct me.
Madam Chair and Councilmember Cunningham, that is correct. The overview number 2, which will be on September 24th, a week from this coming Thursday, we will walk through the details of the changes included in the mayor's recommended budget book that are released on the September 22nd, next Tuesday.
Thank you. So then just to clarify, Director Intermill, most of that meeting will be about diving into the details of the mayor's budget and not departmental presentations. Is that correct?
That is correct, Madam Chair. We'll be giving an overview, so sort of a high-level comparison of where the various reductions to current service level will be seen, but the individual details and specifics with relation to how those what those cuts will mean for service levels and how folks in our city will feel the impact of those cuts would come in the department presentation scheduled to occur in October and early November.
Madam Chair, if I may follow up.
Go ahead.
So the details will be released on the 22nd, so we're getting it at the same time as the public is what I'm assuming that means. Okay.
Yes.
And
yep.
then I heard the phrase iterative process. So can I get some clarification about what does that mean? Like, does that mean that we're going to go back and forth with the mayor throughout this process? Can you explain what iterative process means within this context?
So, Madam Chair and Council Member, that's a good point to highlight. So, I think that this year the mayor has already indicated not only will there be sort of a formal amendment to his recommended budget in mid-October to include the detail of his recommended capital budget plan. He also anticipates, just by virtue of all of the moving pieces, particularly related to the question that Councilmember Fletcher asked about the hiring freeze and holding vacancies open and how that might be able to change or not, depending on the participation in an early retirement incentive program. The mayor has indicated that he intends or I should say, anticipates the need to present an amendment to his recommended budget in the late fall, similar to what has happened in prior years. I think the more the caution or foreshadowing that I intended to give was really, as we get into January, February, March, there may be need to do more of a large-scale update to our budget than we are used to, similar to what we did this year in the revised budget process. Just not only because of the changing economics, but also any changes that may occur at the state level. We've seen those changes happen in the past, and the need to pivot. We are highly dependent on local government aid, for instance, which represents about 20% of our general fund. And so, you know, if there were to be any changes to local government aid next year as the state works its way through its own budget crisis, that would impact the city of Minneapolis meaningfully, and we would have to take action at that point.
And those changes would be coming from the mayor, is what I hear you saying.
So yes, the process that we've been following through these revisions is to mirror the construction and the charter of the budget process, which is the mayor presents a recommendation and then the council modifies that through amendments and ultimately adopts it. So were we to be in a situation next year where there was another sudden dip in revenues, we would follow a similar process to this year where the mayor would make a recommendation and then the council would react.
Okay, you're talking about next year. Thank you for that clarification. I appreciate that. Okay, thank you.
I'm talking about both, council member, and that just highlights the complexity of this budget world that we're living in. So I very much appreciate the questions, and I'm trying to make it as clear as I can, but in the interest of full transparency, some days it's not entirely clear to me.
That's fair. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from my colleagues at this time? Not seeing any. So with that, we've concluded all business to come before committee today. These were just 2 receive and file items and to share kind of the work as we move forward. So without objection, we will stand adjourned. Thank you for your time and for hanging in there with some of these technical glitches today. Thank you.